Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this REMI webinar titled Economic Impact of Connect SoCal, Economic and Environmental Implications. This webinar is being presented by Dr. Gigi Moreno, Senior Economist at Southern California Association of Governments, or SCAG. Dr. Moreno has worked as an applied economist in various roles, including economic consulting, healthcare consulting, academia, and the public sector. At SCAG, Dr. Moreno focuses on policy strategies for inclusive economic growth and is responsible for SCAG's long-range employment projections, integral to the agency's regional land use plan and environmental compliance strategy. Prior to joining SCAG, Dr. Moreno taught environmental, economic, and industrial organization at Cal State University, Long Beach. Dr. Moreno has published numerous peer-reviewed papers in health economics, agricultural and environmental economics, cannabis economics, and climate change policy. In addition to a bachelor's in economics from Carleton College, Dr. Moreno has a PhD in agricultural and natural resource economics from UC Berkeley, and a certificate in geospatial science from UCLA. So now just a couple webinar logistics. At any time during this presentation, you can ask a question into the question box, and time permitting, I will moderate these questions to Dr. Moreno at the end. I'll pass along any unanswered questions at the end of the webinar, and she can reach out if she sees fit. I also want to make everyone aware that shortly after this presentation concludes, a link will be sent to your email that contains the slides and a recording of this presentation. If you have any questions based off these materials, I encourage you to reach out to info@remi.com. We're very excited for this webinar and very happy that Dr. Moreno is able to join us for it. Thank you to everyone who's joined so far. And take it away, Gigi.
Thank you, Brian. And hello, everyone. So I am Gigi Moreno. I'm Senior Economist at the Southern California Association of Governments, or SCAG. Thank you guys for joining this webinar. So today what I'd like to do is I'm going to tell you a little bit about the SCAG region and then share our annual economic update and outlook, which we presented an earlier version of it at SCAG's Economic Summit in December, which we hold every year. And I will share with you some of the results of our regional transportation plan, which we call Connect SoCal. And I'll explain how we used REMI TransSite to gain insights about the economic impacts from our Connect SoCal plan. So let me tell you a little bit about SCAG, if you don't already know. The Southern California Association of Governments was founded in 1965 as an association of local agencies, local governments and agencies that come together to address regional issues. And SCAG is the federally designated Metropolitan Planning Organization, or MPO, for the 6 Southern California counties, which you see here. The counties of Los Angeles, Orange, Riverside, San Bernardino, Ventura, and Imperial. Basically all of Southern California excluding San Diego County. And the SCAG region encompasses 191 cities and is home to nearly 19 million people. So that's about half of the population in the state of California. And measured by 2021 GDP, the SCAG region economy is the 16th largest economy in the world. So a good place to start when talking about assessing the well-being of an economy, and specifically the SCAG region economy, I'd like to look at real GDP per capita, or gross domestic product per capita. And if you guys recall from your econ classes, a real GDP measures a region's total value of goods and services adjusted for inflation. So per capita GDP then measures the region's average economic value per person. And keep in mind that per capita GDP, which I'm going to plot here, per capita GDP measures measures an average value and does not say anything about how equitably this value is distributed. Nevertheless, per capita GDP is a standard measure of economic well-being that's often used to make comparisons across regions and over time. So let's look at real GDP per capita in the SCAG region, which I've plotted here as this dark blue line. And between 2012 and 2019, real GDP per capita in the SCAG region increased steadily to approximately $83,000 per person, and then dropped to $79,000 per person during the pandemic. But then it rebounded to where we are today, which is at approximately $86,000 per person. So let me put this in perspective. Oh, so between 2012 and 2022, real GDP per capita in the SCAG region grew by about 18%. So let me plot the real GDP per capita for the rest of the United States. So meaning the United States excluding the SCAG region, and you'll see that the pattern is very, very similar. And historically, the SCAG region's per capita GDP is above the GDP per capita in the rest of the United States. And so SCAG regions over this time period in the SCAG region, GDP per capita increased by 18%. It increased by 13% in the rest of the U.S. Notice that SCAG regions per capita GDP mirrors the rest of the nation, but since 2012 there appears to be a widening in per capita GDP between the U.S. and the SCAG region. And so some reasons for this include the SCAG region's mix of industries are heavily weighted in higher valued sectors such as tech, professional services, and finance. And even our agricultural sectors in Southern California tend to be in higher valued crops relative to the rest of the United States. In addition, the SCAG region's workforce on average has higher educational attainment than the rest of the U.S. on average. We also have the busiest port complex in the country, with nearly 40% of U.S. imports from Asia are handled at the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. So that gives you a perspective of what life is like here in Southern California. Economic life, anyway. Now let's talk about inflation. Inflation is the rate at which prices increase over a given period of time, and these charts show year-over-year inflation between 2014 and 2023. First, look at the average overall inflation across all urban areas in the U.S., and that's in the maroon line in my chart. And then before the pandemic, we had historically low inflation, hovering around at or below 2%. In July 2022, overall U.S. inflation peaked at 8.5%. I don't think I need to tell you all that. I think we all feel it. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reported inflation at 3.5% for U.S. cities across the U.S. At 3.4%, and at 3.5% in the LA area. And again, inflation in the SCAG region, similar to other economic indicators, it very much follows the U.S. And so in many ways, our region is influence or moves with the rest of the country, which makes sense given that we share an economy. And so let's look at the SCAG region inflation, which I've plotted in blue, which has mirrored the national trends. And up until around the pandemic, around 2020, the inflation in the SCAG region was higher than U.S. inflation. And then during the pandemic, inflation in the SCAG region was below inflation in the United States as a whole. And so during the pandemic, that relationship flipped. And so that's interesting. And some possible reasons for that is that the SCAG region was better able to adapt to supply constraints, responsible for much of the inflation that we have experienced. And another possibility is that a lot of the inflation is driven by housing costs, and housing costs have pretty much been really high in the SCAG region for a long time, and so maybe had nowhere to go. Whereas the rest of the country, the high inflation and housing costs had more room to move up. And so overall inflation, which we're seeing here measured by CPI, is an average inflation across different expenditure categories. So let's look at the different expenditure categories. And just to emphasize that inflation is dependent on different categories of expenditures, and it could differ, and it also differs by location. And so so let's first look at the Los Angeles region, then we can compare it to the US average for each of these categories. And for fun, let's look at inflation in Miami. There seems to be a tendency to want to compare California to Florida, so we're going to go with it. All right, so overall inflation currently December 2023 it was 3.5% in the Los Angeles metropolitan area. And if we look at what's driving that inflation, we can look at inflation in each of the different categories. We have food and beverages, housing, apparel, transportation, medical care, and other goods and services. And you'll see that in the Los Angeles area, inflation appears to be driven by other goods and services, and to a large extent by housing, by inflation in housing. But we also see that medical care has been, prices have been going down in the medical care category, and the apparel care category, there's been no change, and transportation is also, well, kind of on the lower side. So it looks like housing and services are driving inflation in our region. And now let's look at the same inflation in the Miami area. And you'll see inflation in December was at 5.7% in the Miami area. And we can look at inflation in each of the different categories of goods and services for the Miami area. And you'll see it's very different. So even though, and you know what, let me also now put up the US, and this would be the average across the entire US. And so even though inflation across the US is at 3.4%, it varies by location, and it really varies by category, and those categories vary across the regions. I was actually, initially I was kind of shocked to see such high price inflation in apparel in Miami, but then I was thinking, every time I go to Miami, it just seems like everybody's so well dressed, and I come home wanting to spend money on nice clothing. But anyway, I'm not sure if that's what's driving that. So much of the inflation that we're experiencing was driven by supply side constraints due to the COVID-19 pandemic and our response to the pandemic, and also the war in Ukraine. And as you know, inflation erodes our purchasing power, and basically we get less stuff for the same amount of money that you spent. And even though the rate at which prices increase is slowing, prices are still high, and they tend to decrease a lot slower than they increase. And to some extent, the damage has been done. We're not going to get back the money that we already spent on $7 dozens of eggs and $20 sandwiches. So how are SCAG region households doing since the pandemic and the start of the invasion in Ukraine? Oh, actually, let me back up here. Okay. So let's look at real household income in the SCAG region. And overall, household income in the SCAG region has been pretty much flat. So year over year in 2022, it only increased by 0.2%. And that's after accounting for inflation. But then if we break down income across counties in the SCAG region, we see that this actually varies quite a bit. And so Imperial County, which is one of our smaller counties, real household income increased by 4.3%. In Los Angeles County, Los Angeles County, there was no change year over year in real household income. In Orange County, it actually dropped by 2.4%. In Riverside County, increased by 4.4%. In San Bernardino County, also saw an increase in real household income by 2.7%. And in Ventura County, we also saw a small decrease. And I've plotted the line that shows the average change in household income for the U.S. as a whole, and it's at 0.3%. So the U.S., the aggregate change in household income for the U.S. is pretty flat. It's very similar to the SCAG region. And again, showing that when you break down these aggregate statistics by the components of your region, you can actually see very different patterns. And let's see. So it's important to also look at what's going on locally when thinking about policy or when thinking about economic indicators. All right. So let's look at unemployment as another economic indicator for this region. So we clearly averted a much projected recession in 2023. And so the resilience of the SCAG region economy and largely and the US economy as well is clearly seen in the labor market. And here we see monthly unemployment between 2019 and 2023. And this is for the SCAG region. And so despite the labor market disruptions over the past year in our region, in the SCAG region, and since the end of the pandemic, the region's unemployment rate is currently at 5.2%, which is, this is seasonally adjusted, and 5.2% is hovering around historic lows for the SCAG region. And it is a lot higher than the US unemployment rate, which is at seasonally adjusted at 3.8%. And this part of why, so the SCAG region historically is above, the unemployment rate is above the US rate, largely due again to the industry mix that is in our region, that we have in our region, that tends to have higher unemployment rates. So we've seen strong per capita GDP and strong job growth and decreasing, well, we saw a big decrease in unemployment, and we're observing unemployment in our region at historical lows, but the region also faces some challenges. One is, since the pandemic, labor market participation has been a concern, and labor market participation has, in the SCAG region overall, is still below the 2019 levels as shown in this chart. So the dark blue line is the size of the labor force, and that the gray line is the average labor force participation in 2019, so before the pandemic. And one exception is that even though overall the labor force participation in the SCAG region is below the pre-pandemic levels, the San Bernardino and Riverside counties are different in that their labor force participation exceeds pre-pandemic levels. So individual counties in our region have recovered their labor force. So this gap in labor force participation today relative to pre-pandemic levels is small, a little over 100,000 workers that we have missing. And this is driven by a smaller population in our region and increased retirements. So the smaller population in our region is due to reduced foreign migration, which has been a big source of a labor force for the SCAG region, and excess deaths due to COVID, and a spike in net domestic migration and lower fertility in our region long before the pandemic. So increased retirements are also driving this lower labor force participation, and it's really being driven by rational economic choices. Asset values are at historic highs, and for many older workers, it makes sense to retire and enjoy their wealth. But I also think, even though we see this gap in the labor force participation, it's also perhaps an opportunity to change our business as usual approach to the labor force. And some optimistic news is that the Bureau of Labor Statistics recently reported the largest labor force participation among disabled workers since 2008. And so I think this is a sign, a signal that we should be thinking about leveraging this momentum to help close this labor force participation gap. I think this is an opportunity to make genuine efforts to remove obstacles for populations who had been previously sidelined from the labor force to enter the labor force. So this includes disabled workers, parents needing childcare, and previously incarcerated workers. So this is an opportunity to help broaden our labor force participation. Another challenge that our region faces is racial and gender wage inequity. And this chart shows the wages by race and gender relative to white men's wages in the SCAG region. So relative to white men, all workers of color. So let me just show you some of these lines. So the first one, the green one, we have the Black worker wages in the SCAG region as a percentage of white men's wages. And you'll see in 1992, Black workers in the SCAG region earned about 70% of white men's wages. And in 2022, they earned 62%. So that seems to be getting worse. That's definitely getting worse. And we look at the Hispanic workers, which is our largest group of workers by race. Hispanic workers in the SCAG region were earning 54% of white men's wages. And in 1992 and 2022, they were earning 59%. And Asian workers have tended to do better. In 92, they were earning 79% of white men's workers' wages and 93% in 2022. And then women were earning 64% of white men's wages in 92, and now they're earning 66%. So historically, it looks like by race, workers are still experiencing a lot of inequity in wages. However, I want to point out that between 2021 and 2022, we saw a little increase in the percent of white men's wages that all of these groups earned. And so I'm looking at this, hopefully, that policies are changing and starting to take an effect, and that perhaps this trend of narrowing the wage gaps will keep going. I hope that it is a trend. It's only one data point, but so there's a little hope there that it's not all bad forever. So why does this matter? How much would our region gain from eliminating these wage gaps? Why should we care that we have these wage gaps? So we estimated that the SCAG region GDP would be 17% larger had we eliminated all wage gaps in 2021. And so we report this research in our regional briefing book, which I'll give you a link to it shortly. And so if we eliminated all these wage gaps, we would observe an increase in GDP. So the value of our economies could grow by eliminating these wage gaps. And so that's why we care, because we can think of, we're leaving a dollar on the table by not addressing wage inequities in our regions. The other thing I wanted to show you is for the rest of California and the rest of the US, the impacts would be a lot smaller. And a lot of this is driven by the extent of how diverse the labor force is, and also the extent of wage gaps in different regions. So the benefit of eliminating wage gaps will depend on the region and the makeup of the region and the extent of wage inequities. All right, so that's a rundown of short range outlook for the region, the SCAG region. So despite the persistent inflation, rising interest rates, labor disputes, empty office buildings, and high-profile projections of a recession in 2023, the SCAG regional economy, and largely the U.S. economy as well, have proved to be tenaciously resilient. Today I've highlighted so far the low unemployment rates and slowing inflation. And we've averted a recession and continue to see momentum in the regional economy going into 2024. But as continued high interest rates, we expect to see some slowing in the economy. And we're starting to see some slowing in the labor market. And this is expected when you have very aggressive monetary policy. Nevertheless, I think we should celebrate the solid economy we had in 2023, despite some obstacles, and we should celebrate the observed reduced wage disparities. And I think overall we can say that the economic system seems to be working, but we need to be prepared for slower growth in 2024. So in California, it faces specific challenges due to the budget shortfall at the state, which will have impacts on our region and our cities. Nevertheless, cities can help reduce obstacles for growth and nurture economic resilience by investing in our infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, and leveraging new developments in our region. And you can get more details and more of these charts at, by accessing the regional briefing book, which you can get at this QR code, which you see on your screen. And the very long URL is in there as well. Now, what I wanted to do next is turn to SCAG's long-range plan, which is probably what you're here for, because this is where the REMI Transite model becomes really important for us. So in addition to keeping track of the short-term outlook in our economy, we also spend time looking at long-range economic projections to help inform SCAG's long-range plan. And SCAG is federally required to produce a regional transportation plan, which is a comprehensive long-range plan for our transportation infrastructure. And we're also required to develop a sustainable community strategy plan for reducing greenhouse gas emissions under California Senate Bill 375, and all of these requirements are embedded in our quadrennial Connect SoCal plan, and that's available through this QR code. And what I'd like to do is share a little bit about what the plan is about, and so, or what the plan's goals are. So SCAG's plan's goals are fourfold. One is we want to build and maintain a robust transportation network, and this involves system preservation and resilience, complete streets, integrating transit and multimodal transportation, and demand management. So a variety of projects that improve mobility in our region. We want to support communities by developing and connecting and sustaining livable and thriving communities. Excuse me. We want to promote a healthy environment for our region, not only for the people living here today, but also in the future. And then support economic development, sustainable, efficient economic development to bring opportunities for all people, so equitable development throughout our region. And Connect SoCal includes 89 different policies and many strategies for achieving these goals, and the publication in the QR code I showed earlier outlines these goals. And the question that I would like to address today is share with you how we think this plan will affect, what impacts will this plan have on the regional economy, the SCAG regional economy. And to help policymakers better understand what the impacts of the plan may be, we use REMI Transite and other tools to simulate the economy with and without the plan investments. So the conceptual framework that we adopted to assess the economic impacts of Connect SoCal begins with market-based impacts, and that's where we use REMI Transite, is to help us understand how the regional economy will change over the 25-year period over which we're planning in Connect SoCal. But we also recognize that there are significant co-benefits from the plan. So these are, you might want to call them non-market or benefits that we enjoy from improved transportation infrastructure, improved efficiency of our transportation networks, and also from reducing greenhouse gas emissions, because our plan requires us to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And then we also look at local conditions that will either help or possibly hurt our ability to enjoy the potential benefits from the plan. And just to give you a preview, improving our equities, I talked about a few slides ago, improving our equity in our region, economic equity in our region, will allow us to get greater benefits from the plan, and in fact almost 20% more. And in order to fully enjoy the benefits from this plan, we also have to build adequate housing. And then there's going to be some impacts that we can't quantify. And I don't pretend to be able to quantify those, but I just want to put that out there as there are impacts that we cannot measure. So economic impact analysis is grounded in the idea that each dollar spent in the region stimulates additional economic activity that multiplies or ripples through the economy, which we call the multiplier effect. This multiplier effect captures incremental output, employment, personal income, government revenue in a region that exceeds the initial investment. And this figure is intended to show the how this transportation infrastructure investments that we're making in Connect SoCal feed into the economy and have multiple effects. So to implement Connect SoCal, workers will be employed to design, to build, to operate and maintain transportation projects. And these new jobs will have a direct effect on the economy. And this is the direct effect of this expenditure. In addition, these new jobs will also ripple through the economy, creating additional jobs through what we call indirect and induced effect. And the combined effect is the total effect, which is ultimately what we want to measure with Transite. Jobs, so jobs in companies that supply the goods and services to the new projects make up the indirect effects. So So these are the jobs for the companies that are going to be providing the wood or the metal that go into building new roads, or the asphalt or the trucks or whatever it is that that you need to build the bike lanes, or to build the express lanes as part of our plan. And then the firms and agencies that build and maintain the transportation systems, they buy material, office supplies, business services, and all of these purchases necessitated by these indirect effects will then result in induced effects, because then the employees that are working for these companies, they're going to change their behavior because they have higher income, they're buying more goods. And so that's how the plan investments generate more economic activity beyond what is directly spent on building and operating the projects that are part of this plan. All right, so an important point, or an important piece of doing economic impact analysis, is that we have to recognize that we necessarily have to make assumptions in order to make the models tractable. And we should keep these assumptions in mind when we are both developing the inputs to the model, but also when we're interpreting the model. So keep in mind that when we're doing economic impact analysis with a model such as REMI, we're assuming that the current industry distribution of employment approximates the future distribution of employment. So the range of industries is going to be the same today as it is 25 years ago, 25 years from now. And economic changes induced by the plan will occur gradually. We're not implementing Connect SoCal and causing a shock to the economy. And the impacts from the plan are a small share of the total regional economy. Another assumption that we make is that the fundamental supply and demand relationships remain stable during the study period. And so for Connect SoCal, the study period is 25 years, and we're going to assume there aren't any pandemics, there aren't any rogue countries invading independent countries, or there aren't wars. And so with this framework in mind, we want to build an economic impact analysis scenario that will help us measure economic impacts. And so we want to be as realistic as possible in developing a scenario. And so in order to develop that scenario, we need to ask, what are the expected changes that Connect SoCal, that projects will trigger? And we also, of course, have to ask, well, what's the time frame? And so then we set up the expected changes from this policy, and those expected changes are then the inputs to the REMI Transite model. And let's see, so in the Connect SoCal case, the triggers are going to be the investments in the project. So these are expenditures in the transportation projects that will occur over the next 25 years, or that we plan over the next 25 years. And we work closely, so my team, the economic team, works closely with SCAG's transportation finance team, and the transportation finance team inventories all the specific projects that are planned throughout the 25-year period that Connect SoCal covers. And with input from our regional stakeholders, our transportation finance team then compiles the expenditures associated with each of the projects. And then they provide me a table of expenditures, and then we map them, these expenditures by category. We map them then to the input categories in the Transite model. So why don't I show you the table that summarizes where we think the triggers or the impacts are going to be in the economy from Connect SoCal projects. And so the categories of expenditures that we expect for, to affect from Connect SoCal projects include highway construction, highway design, highway operation and maintenance, local streets and road construction, local streets and road operation and maintenance, multimodal construction, multimodal design, and multimodal operation and maintenance. And we assign NICS codes for each of these. And you know, as we're developing these scenarios, it's important to keep in mind that we're trying to build a scenario that is as realistic as possible and that will satisfy the assumptions I talked about in the last a couple slides ago. And this involves talking to in our case, to our transportation finance team to make sure that we're capturing in our modeling, that we're capturing what we expect the projects what economic impacts we expect the projects to have. And I really think that when we do economic impact analysis, I think this step of understanding how projects are going to affect the economy are really important, because if you don't have good inputs to the REMI model, then you're not going to get good outputs either. So it's important to put together a realistic and defensible list of potential impacts from our plan. So with the way we set it up, we have our expenditure categories, and then we estimate in 5-year intervals how much each category, what the expenditures will be in each different category. And so the overall expenditures in the SCAG region is about $413 billion over this 25-year period. And so then this becomes the input to Transite. And we run the Transite model with these inputs, and we get our outputs. Now, Transite gives us a lot of different outputs. And for Connect SoCal, we focus on 2 outputs, and one is job creation, and the second is changes in GDP. And so this table shows you the results of the Transite model, and it shows the average annual jobs created for each of the counties and the SCAG region as a whole. And this is computed as the baseline, which is a baseline of the regional economy, the difference between the baseline and the simulated economy with all the different projects from Connect SoCal implemented. And you'll see that over the entire SCAG region, the Transite model projects a new jobs on average will be 277,000 new jobs per year, an annual average over the life of these projects. And you'll see that, so Los Angeles County is the largest county and observes the largest growth. And we can see GDP as an output as well. And so these are the effects of implementing the projects, the Connect SoCal projects. And GDP will increase on average by $19.4 billion a year with the plan than without the plan. And okay, so we've implemented the projects, we have we've generated jobs and greater GDP from implementing the various projects. But when we implement these projects, we also get an added benefit of improving transportation efficiency in the SCAG region. And so we want to be able to capture that, and Transite allows us to customize the travel demand parameters in the model so that we can customize based on SCAG's modeling team's projections of how the transportation efficiency, how will be affected by the Connect SoCal projects. And so once we incorporate the efficiency gains in our transportation system, we see that we get much greater employment growth in the SCAG region, that we project much greater employment growth for 188 versus 277. This is 480,000 additional jobs. And this is, so this is the full effect of the of Connect SoCal projects, both from the direct investment in the infrastructure, in our transportation infrastructure, but also in gains from additional efficiency, meaning that we've reduced the cost of getting around, of moving people, moving goods around in our region from the improved infrastructure. And now in terms of GDP, we see that we see gains in GDP of $47.9 billion this is in 2023 dollars. And this is on average over the entire plan period. Now, in addition, so I mentioned earlier when I talked about the framework, so in addition to what I'm calling these market measurable effects, we also have other benefits to the region from reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, because our Connect SoCal plan includes strategies for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And we estimated what the value of the reduced greenhouse gas emissions. So here in this chart shows you, the blue line shows you the trend in greenhouse gas emissions that we've estimated, and then it shows you the greenhouse gas emissions under the plan. And this gray shaded area are the reduction in million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions. So then we used so we valued these reductions in greenhouse gas emissions using the social cost of carbon, the social cost of greenhouse gas emissions, social cost of greenhouse gases, to estimate the value of reducing emissions. And we estimate the value from the plan to be $6.6 billion. Now, going back to the question of equity, and so if we completely reduce wage inequities in the SCAG region, GDP would increase by almost 17%, which same thing as the table earlier that I showed earlier. And so we would have 17% greater benefits potentially from the Connect SoCal projects with a perfectly equitable economy. Granted, I recognize we probably would not reach full equity, at least not right away. But I think here is some potential for increasing the benefits that we get from the Connect SoCal projects. And to explore this a little further, as policymakers, we might ask, what could we do to help reduce this inequity in wages? And so we want to look at what are some of the drivers of wage inequity in the SCAG region. And so we estimated that, so these are, excuse me, the drivers of inequity in the region. We looked at employment, hours worked, differences in employment, differences in hours worked, differences in education, differences in educational utilization. Educational utilization is when employees are hired to do work that requires their educational attainment. So, for example, when someone with a bachelor's degree has a job that requires a bachelor's degree, their education is being utilized. And then we had a residual. So this red bar shows you the total gains from eliminating inequity. And in our region, the biggest inequity is residual, meaning the stuff we can't measure. But among the things we can measure, it's education and hours worked. And I think this gives you a hint in a way to policymakers about where you can start reducing inequity. And I think one of those is education and hours worked. So a more equitable distribution of hours worked. Perhaps this could be childcare and providing childcare to the extent that hours worked is limited by availability of childcare. And education is another piece. Less so opportunities for employment, and it seems like in our region, educational utilization is not driving the wage difference. Now, a very large portion is the stuff we don't know. And so those are things that we need to research more and understand. I quickly plotted the same chart, but for the US. And for the US as a whole, hours worked and employment are a little bigger contributors to inequities in wages than in the SCAG region. And education is a little, it's a lot smaller share than in the SCAG region. So finally, another factor that will affect the SCAG region's ability to observe all those benefits that we computed using Transite from Connect SoCal projects is adequate housing. And so we approximated how would the benefits from Connect SoCal change if we do not build adequate housing. And so we were able to use our scenarios in developing our plan. We had a scenario where we built sufficient housing, and then we had a scenario where we had what we call the low scenario, where we had insufficient housing, where we're not meeting our housing demand. And the difference would be would give us an estimate of how much we would lose from not building enough housing. And in terms of employment, we would have a lower employment by 7.4% than what we project we would gain from Connect SoCal projects if we're unable to build adequate housing. So this is the lost projected employment if housing is inadequate. And I think right now that this is specific to the SCAG region, but this could be informative outside the SCAG region, because a lot of other regions are beginning to see a housing crunch as well. And that's my presentation for today. I thank you guys for joining me. And if you have questions or you'd like to reach out, my email is here. And I think we can open it for questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gigi, for the great presentation. And thank you to everyone who joined us for this webinar. If you have a question, I definitely encourage you to enter it in the question box now. And as we'll be getting into that shortly. I also want to remind everybody that a copy of the slides and a recording of this presentation will be sent to you in about an hour after this webinar concludes. So keep your eye out for that email. And if you have any questions based off of those materials, I definitely encourage you to reach out to either Gigi's email, which is currently on the screen, or reach out to us at info@remi.com, and we'll be sure to help you in any way we can. So now some questions have come in, and the first one is someone asked, I wondered if REMI provides the data on wage by demographic features, and where is the data source? So then they guess BLS, which is a good guess. It is accurate that we do use BLS data, and we also take data from other sources like the BEA, RSQE, Census, a bunch of different organizations like that. The next question is, does SCAG do any project prioritization through cost-benefit ratios in Transite to calculate which projects to complete first from the Connect SoCal plan, or is that done a different way?
We do use a benefit cost analysis, but that we use a model separate from REMI for that analysis. And in terms of prioritizing, to the best of my knowledge, we don't use the benefit cost analysis for prioritizing the specific projects And keep in mind, we have 191 cities. So the cities and the local transportation commissions do the prioritizing. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. The next question is, what is the proxy value for social benefit for a metric ton reduction in greenhouse gas?
Oh, 59. We use $59 a metric ton, which I recognize is really low, and I know that EPA put out a number that's closer to $119 a year ago, I guess, maybe a couple of years ago. We wanted to be super conservative. So yes, that's a good question. What we computed as benefits is perhaps very low, or the most conservative measure that we thought we could defend.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Another question that just came in is, how does travel efficiency improvements benefit, or how, okay, sorry, it's worded a bit. How travel efficiency improvements benefits added to job growth estimated? Based on my experience with Transite, travel demand changes will add user benefits such as travel time savings, emission reductions, but they don't add jobs directly. So they're talking about making travel more efficient. How does it contribute to job growth estimates?
Oh, the employment, oh gosh, what I'm doing now, oh gosh, now you caught me. What's the variable name? It's the labor availability variable in the Transite model. So the labor changes through the labor availability, and in our case as well. So our travel demand model, which we input into REMI, reflects decreased time that it takes. So I think in REMI it's the amount of time it takes to get from point A to point B in different types of vehicles, and so in the SCAG's activity-based model, we compute vehicle miles traveled, we compute the hours traveled, so we compute the amount of time, and that's shrinking when we improve our transportation efficiency. So hopefully that answered the question, and so then that feeds into REMI, which then reduces the cost of labor costs.
For the thoughtful response. We have a couple more questions. We might just have time for the one, but we'll see. So could you also elaborate more on the wage inequality and how you define the proportion each factor contributes to it, including employment, education, and residual?
So that was computed. So we computed it. So what we did is we used a method by so there's a paper by the author. The lead author is Shelby. It's the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco published the methodology, and they conducted the study for the U.S. But basically, we take for each category, we compare wages, say at different education levels, and so then we replace the average education variable for a white worker compared to whatever race worker, like say Hispanic worker, and then compare that gap, and so then we do that for each of the variables where we compare the observed wages and the observed educational attainment for one of the variables, and so then the difference that's explained by education, then that's how we measure that difference. And so we go through and we do that for each of the variables on that chart. And so check out the paper by, the author is Shelby, and it's the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. And I think it's now a Brookings paper as well.
Thank you for that. I think just to have enough time to wrap up, we will finish there. I want to again thank you, Dr. Moreno, for the excellent presentation. I want to thank everyone again who attended for your interest in this webinar and our webinars in general. And keep your eye out for that email in about an hour with the materials that I was mentioning, the slides and the recording. And we hope to see you at a future webinar. Thank you very much, and we hope you have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.